Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Trialogues podcast, where we debate issues of the day related to leadership, marketing, and innovation, with a particular focus on the real estate industry. My name is Matthew Shadbolt, and I'm the Director of Interactive Product and Marketing at the Corcoran Group. And I'm joined, as always, by my good friends, Rob Hahn and Gaylord DeWald, who are here today to talk about second screen technology and user behavior and the future of how people watch and interact with television. That's going to be our topic for this particular podcast. Rob and Gaylord, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Gaylord. This is Rob Hahn. I'm the Managing Director of 7DS Associates and a blogger where I write about real estate issues and various other sundry things, including top 10 videos of the 80s on Notorious R.O.B. And happy to be here. I think this is going to be a fun topic.
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm doing well as well as is Gaylord DeWald, President and Janitor of Thought Faucet, based out of the Howard Space Center in Burlington, Vermont. And one screen isn't enough, so the more screens, the merrier, right? Just screen it all up all the time.
Well, for those of you that aren't familiar with what we're already beginning to talk about, there's been a number of very, very key and very, very interesting television events over the past really couple of weeks. We've had Felix Baumgartner's Jump from Space, which was a very, very big event online in particular through the Red Bull and YouTube partnership. And there's also been the presidential debates. There's also been things like the baseball playoffs, and a number of reality TV shows have come to their conclusions through season finales. So it got us thinking about the behavior of how people actually consume television. And when we started to think about it, we said, well, very often people have another device in their hand while they're watching TV, be it an iPad or an iPhone or some other smartphone type of device. And the space between actually watching the TV and the relevance of actually what's going on this other screen, what's characterized as the second screen, is a really, really interesting transition, reflective of how television is actually becoming more social. And the great example of this is that data is starting to emerge from organizations like Nielsen, for example, that during the vice presidential debate, 10% of their overall viewership was actually interacting with the debate online simultaneously. And that's primarily related to platforms like Facebook and Twitter. So what's happening is that people are actually interacting with each other in a very social way on these other platforms, either as distraction from what's going on the TV or as a way to feel connected to a larger sense of community about that particular subject matter. And we see this in sports in particular, and reality TV, and larger news events. And it's gaining some momentum. As we reach election season and things like that. So we thought it would be an interesting topic to explore today. One of the things that I'm particularly interested, that I was chatting with Rob and Gaylord about before the show, is the relationship between what's actually being consumed on those devices and what's on TV, whether they're related or not. Because the strength of the interaction, the watching of the show is enhanced if they're related, but very often that isn't really the case. And I had performed a very informal poll of people that I'm connected to on Facebook to ask about whether those things would be related or not. And very often they're not. You're watching like a regular kind of TV show and just grazing online, whether that's through social networks or like a news app or something like that, but it's totally unrelated to the show. So when TV no longer holds our attention, what's actually happening is that we're actually just switching devices altogether. And Gaylord, you had some very interesting thoughts about that particular process. If you want to jump in here.
Yeah. So some of this, it comes down to what's changing about human behavior. We've got two devices. Before we just had the TV, and then we had the remote, so we could sit on the couch and click around. And I should throw out a disclaimer that I gave up my television in 1993. So just like this is a show that discusses the real estate industry from the perspective of three guys who don't actively buy or sell real estate as real estate agents, I'm a non-TV guy. But with that in mind, so we had we just had it so that we could watch TV with a clicker, and if we got to a commercial, we'd click and graze through different channels. And now and then we had the TiVo, so that would cut out all the ads, and so we could skip through. But now it's like you can just leave it on in the background and just sort of switch around. So before we were captured on one device, the TV, and our use case sitting in the room watching the TV. Now we can switch to whole other devices. And I think that has big implications for producers of content for either box, whether it's TV or whatever the mobile device in your hand is, but also for advertisers and marketers, right? So it was worrisome for advertisers to have their advertisements chopped out of content streams, but now they could still be on there. Who cares if it's TiVo? We just ignore the TV and start using Twitter. And as we know, our friends and social engagements through our Twitter feed or Facebook feed or any of those things is going to be infinitely more engaging than whatever commercial is on, or maybe even whatever show is on. So that migration from one box to the other, I think, is a pretty important one. But there's also the split of, and you were bringing this up, Matthew, of how do we use it? Are we using it to enhance our understanding and experience of the large screen content, and so we're discussing it with our friends, or are we simply casually ignoring it and we're not really paying attention to either? So it's just sort of the passive use of it, and I think that's a really important distinction, because if you have a TV show going on, you want people to be using that second screen to continue the dialogue about your TV. So your TV show becomes what Hugh MacLeod would call the social object. We're all talking about that thing that's on TV. But if they're on the second screen and they're not talking about your thing, then as a content producer for the box, then you're not really into it. I don't know. That's kind of my rambling initial round of thoughts of it. But it's that switch from one screen to the other that I think is it's important.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the use case that I've had most recently is to do with the Yankee playoffs. I'm a big New York Yankees baseball fan, and they've been performing dismally in the playoffs. And baseball is one of those things where you don't have to have your attention on it every single moment. It's not like you're watching like a drama or something where your attention.
Yeah, baseball takes forever. It's boring.
Your attention is much stronger in a drama, whereas baseball, even the experience of going to a baseball game is enhanced when it's more social, and the the need to sort of go with your friends or your family, it makes the experience of actually being physically at the game stronger. So this is sort of like the digital version of that. And, for me, consoling myself with other people that I'm connected with on Twitter, or moaning about a particular batter or something like that, it does actually enhance my experience of the game, because it actually makes it more reflective of actually physically being there. And it allows us to sort of collectively wallow in our misery about how everybody's doing in a way that actually saves the game and makes it more enjoyable, for the long run, in a way that, completely diverts attention away from advertising. That's for sure. Advertising is the big victim of that whole process, and there's a lot of advertising that goes on in the playoff coverage, of course. But it allows us to sort of celebrate those key moments as well. There's been a number of moments in the Yankee playoffs where there's been very sort of unexpected home runs and heroic moments, if you like, that have allowed us to sort of share those things in a way that has never really been possible before. And I think it's really it's a really interesting development. And Gaylor, to your point, it's a really interesting space of innovation and opportunity, I think, if that makes sense.
It does. There's a question that kind of comes to mind when you're describing this, though, and I don't know if there's an answer to it, but it goes like this: if part of your enjoyment of the game that you're watching on TV really centers around your social activity with your friends that's happening online, is the game on TV really just like a MacGuffin for building emotional attachment to your friends? So that, like, there's a part of me that wonders how much of that, like the game itself is maybe inconsequential. I mean, it's just some people kicking a ball around or whatever, or in baseball hitting it, I guess. I wonder whether there's something kind of, one of these like deeper human moments or whatever. Yeah, the game is just an opportunity for you to build stronger relationships.
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, if I was going to be the sort of cynical marketer about it, I would say absolutely. But I think, the sporting events always provide an opportunity to do that in the real world and in the digital one, I think. They simply provide a venue to come together in many ways. And, another interesting example of exactly what you're talking about is the presidential debates that have been going on over the past 3 weeks. And how following along on Twitter actually does enhance your experience of watching it. So, for example, like I follow a lot of journalists from the New York Times, and what they do is they're fact-checking what the candidates are actually saying in pretty much real time. So when one candidate says, well, the economy's grown by X%, they're actually fact checking that in real time, and it actually allows you to it allows you to consume the content in a way that is very, very different from simply just listening to what they have to say. And it's a really interesting set of opportunities, I think, because inserting yourself into that content production kind of process, and these news feeds, as these events go on, the larger the event, the faster the information flows through that news feed. I mean, one of the things that we experienced here in New York is when the Giants won the Super Bowl, there was something like 13,000 tweets per second going through Twitter at that particular moment. So the volume of information is vast. And standing out is obviously, of sort of a key thing. I mean, Rob, I as we bring this kind of stuff up, I want you to jump in here. What do you think?
I think we're talking about sort of two different things here, right? On the one hand, kind of the grazing behavior that Gaylord's talking about, I'm familiar with it a whole lot because that's really kind of how my wife watches TV. I only watch NFL games pretty much on TV and ESPN, so I'm not a really good subject for it either. Well, that and presidential debates, I guess. But I guess I kind of see that particular usage of second screen as, sort of the grazing, as indicative of the fact that whatever is on TV is just not that compelling. In other words, it's not necessarily like watching TV, so therefore I have to open up my iPad and follow along, in some active way. It's actually just, more I want to relax, right? It's just leisure time, and the TV happens to be on, but I'm also kind of doing this, and I'm sort of paying attention to what's going on TV, and I'm sort of not, and I'm kind of checking my email or, posting status updates on Facebook or what have you. So that's one sort of use case for the second screen, right? The second use case, though, that you guys are bringing up, I think, is far more interesting, which is more of an active engagement, more of a, going from just a passive observer to somehow being far more active in what you're seeing on TV. Obviously, the great use cases there are kind of what you mentioned, sporting events, I guess major political events like, the presidential debates or vice presidential debates, where, you're all kind of watching it happen at that time. It's not a pre-recorded show. It's not a sitcom, right, that you think is going to go on rerun. This is something that, for whatever reason, you're invested in, and you're now wanting to take part in it in some way. Like the Giants Super Bowl game, Giants fans are going to want to be a quote part of it somehow. They're not happy just sitting there and being a passive audience member, right? I think that's one thing we want to distinguish.
because I don't really see that there's a whole lot of value in the first use case, right? I think what that really says is that content that you're putting on the TV is just not that valuable. People just aren't paying any attention to it. It's just kind of half there, and they don't really care, if commercials come on or not. They've got their second screen. And I think for me, I look at that and say that's just leisure time, right? I just want to relax. I don't want to think about work. I don't want to think about kids or what have you. I think the second one is far more interesting, which is when there's something going on and the audience wants to be a part of it. You guys agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I absolutely would.
Yeah, I guess the question there is, if we're talking about those types of things, there are two questions I have with that. One is, what are the types of content, whether it's TV, internet?
Yeah, I've got a couple of specific examples kind of on this theme. I think you're absolutely right that the opportunity, if there is one, is in the situations where people are actively engaged as opposed to just kind of randomly tweeting about stuff or whatever. But the kinds of content around which people are going to be engaged, I think it kind of starts to lead into the old school event marketing, or scheduled marketing. Where people, because you need to have in Twitter or other live stream events, everyone has to actually be experiencing the same thing at the same time. So while most digital interactions are kind of what they call asynchronous, where I can post something and 10 hours later someone else can do it or whatever. We all have to be experiencing something at the same time in the real world, which is why something like a baseball game or television in general serves as an excellent way to basically round up a bunch of people at the same time, because television operates on that kind of linear schedule. And from there, I think it just depends on topic. There's some people are going to get interested in sports, and they're going to talk about sports, and some people are going to be interested in politics. And it's just the television can maybe be used as a way to corral an audience to all be paying attention or halfway paying attention so that they can also tweet at the same time. Or a live news event. And a specific example that comes to mind for me was in 2009 or whatever, February 2009. It was a bunch of stuff starting to go down in Bahrain. And this is a totally bizarre situation, but the Twitter hashtag in the town that I live in Burlington, is #BTV. It's our airport code. Mm-hmm. And Bahrain television is so bad that people were complaining about that television station when certain news shows would come on in Bahrain, and they would use the BTV hashtag. So while we have a kind of a small town and we're all using the hashtag, at kind of regular intervals, we just get totally swamped with chatter from individuals watching just the news channel in Bahrain. And that's when I first started thinking about this exact concept of what is it that gets people worked up. In this case, they were all really upset with the kind of coverage. They felt that they were being lied to or whatever, and they had a lot of interesting ways of dealing with it. But it was like clockwork. I knew when the news channel was showing in Bahrain, because our Twitter feed would just get totally flooded over it. But I think it can also happen on narrative content. Sometimes, when people are watching a big finale TV show, I know it in my Twitter stream because everyone's talking about whatever the show is. So I think that narrative content has a choice there as well. But the main thing is that it's scheduled in some way so that the audience is rounded up around that thing. It's kind of like the television becomes the clock by which everyone else organizes that conversation.
Yeah, I agree, Gaylord. Yeah. And what's happening when everybody assembles around that one particular event, if you like, is that there's astronomical explosion of activity online. And what's one of the things that's really interesting to watch with the presidential debates in particular is the speed at which the memes are working. And you and I were talking about this before the call. Is that within 5 minutes of Romney making the binders full of women remark, there was a Facebook page not only made and full of content, but that had 50,000 fans associated with it within 5 minutes of him making that particular remark. So when you can corral these people together at massive scale like this, around a scheduled event where it's broadcast across multiple TV channels simultaneously and has this massive back channel associated with it, the spaces for creating something that is probably short-lived but has immense use for its lifespan is the opportunity seems to be very high. I mean, there's Twitter accounts for things like Laughing Joe Biden or Silent Jim Lehrer was another one, and these things are getting very, very big very, very quickly, and I think they often sort of fall away like any good meme does. It ages very, very quickly, and it goes back on the shelf with things like the Bronx Cobra and things like that. But I think that it's a really, really interesting, type of conversation for people in the real estate industry to start having. Very many times on this podcast, we've talked about this idea of skating where the puck is going to be. And this is user behavior that happens today that I don't see anybody in the real estate industry working with, but it's happening at massive scale on the web. And I think that those kinds of conversations are really, really interesting.
Well, so here's something to really think about. I love this topic because it's really stretching, kind of my thinking on it. So think about those political memes, right? The Laughing Joe Bidens, the binders full of women, those things. I wonder two things. One is, who's doing it? Right? Like, who's actually doing it? And then the second one is, what's the purpose behind it? And here's kind of what I mean by this. As marketers, we all know that word of mouth marketing, it's been around pretty much for as long as marketing's existed. And there's always been these concepts of kind of like the connector and the leader. And you know what I'm saying? You guys remember all of those? Like there's all these terms like social butterfly. There are these people,
sure.
If you, right?
Yeah,
there was an experiment that was done, I can't remember, a few years back or a dozen years back, famous experiment with they try to get a package to a particular person in Massachusetts.
Yeah,
right? And people
Malcolm Gladwell talks a lot about this. He
talks
about influence
and then
outliers and different.
Yeah, and what you find is that there are these individuals who are influencers and there are these individuals who are social connectors.
Yeah.
Right? So the first question I guess I have, when you look at these sort of, meme explosions on the internet, the first observation, obviously, is the existence of the technology, the existence of Facebook, the existence of Twitter, the existence of these things enables it at a much faster rate. But the underlying, mechanics should be the same. Meaning, if some influencer, started some sort of action, some sort of meme, even if it's not, not online, not on Facebook, and they connect to a social connector, then that should spread very quickly, right, throughout whatever the networks are. So the first question is who's doing these things, and I think that's probably going to be an important thing for anybody who wants to be in, communications, marketing, whatever, to understand and identify. But the second question to me is, what's the purpose behind it? In other words, whoever started, let's say the binder full of women, was that person, it doesn't strike me as the kind of thing that you do if you're trying to convince somebody. I guess that's the way I would look at it, right? So it almost feels like the reason to do that meme is almost to corral other people who think the way you do, right? It's almost like a tribal marker than it is a sales pitch. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. The same thing with Laughing Joe Biden, right? I mean, somebody who's not already thinking like you is not going to get on that, not going to, that's just not going to really interact with it. So I feel like those are more like tribal markers saying, hey, you're part of my tribe. By liking this page, you're sort of declaring, you're one of us. Right.
And I think there's also, as with any meme thing, there's also just an element of status building or like for comedic effect. Like there may be people who are going to vote for Romney, but also kind of found that statement sort of funny. and so they'll go, yeah, I like that because that's kind of a funny statement. And like there are people like that will be that are going after like meme building in general, just merely regardless of how it influences one person or another, going at it strictly from a perspective of status or displaying their own wit.
Right. So the question then for a marketer, for the real estate industry, to try and bring it back to me is, how do you leverage that? Because I haven't yet seen this type of meme explosion. I haven't yet seen this type of back channel or, whatever, actually be used in an effective way to convince anybody. And I haven't yet seen it used in an effective way to sell anything, whether it's an idea or a candidate or anything. I haven't yet seen that. And I'm wondering, is that where the opportunity lies?
Yeah.
But just take a specific example. Yesterday's debate, I don't know if you guys saw the entire thing or not. There was an actual question from some woman about, I think it was a question to Romney, and she specifically asked about the mortgage interest deduction. Did you guys catch that?
Yeah.
I didn't see anything come out of it. Right? I didn't see, I just didn't see any sort of sustained effort of people talking about that. Whereas clearly this is like one of the most important things for the National Association of Realtors.
Yeah, the only thing I saw on Twitter about it was Jed Kolko from Trulia kind of mentioning that nobody's talking about it.
Right.
That was that was basically the only thing I saw about it when I was following along on Twitter.
Right. So I guess what I'm wondering now is let's just for the time being imagine that somebody from NAR is listening to this podcast. They say, oh yeah, what we ought to do is for the next debate, whenever something like this comes up, we should create this meme, right? It's like NAR should go out there and start tweeting about, hey, did you just hear this question? And did you know, your mortgage introduction is going to go away? And you could imagine them trying to do that, right? My question is, would that be effective?
Actually, I couldn't imagine them. No.
Why?
And the reason is that the kind of operation that you're describing requires a tremendous degree of flexibility on the part of the organization, and very clearly absorbed throughout the entire organization the kind of a sense of the goal or whatever. And I don't say this to say NAR is a dinosaur organization and they can't do anything. That's not what I mean. I just mean that to take advantage of something in real time and develop and deploy content in less than 5 minutes that's a really difficult thing to do. Mm-hmm. And for any organization to take advantage of that would be a real challenge, and it would require a very high degree of capability, and I guess we call organizational alignment, within the group, so that whoever it is that's watching and making this content in 5 minutes or less has the authority to do it without fear of losing their jobs, and that everyone's kind of in line. I mean, that's a high level of capability. And I think a lot of these memes are started by individuals. Some of them aren't. Some of them aren't. Some of them are by groups that are prepared to pounce on these kinds of things. But they've essentially been, in the political sense, they've been essentially waiting for 18 months or longer with whatever file of stuff they have to deploy it. But individuals who don't have an organizational structure to answer to, they can deploy on these things very quickly. And that's what I mean by I don't see NAR being able to pull that off in the current configuration.
And to your point, Gaylord, I think, in many ways there's nothing worse than an artificially created meme.
Right.
The idea of an organization pouncing on opportunities to create memes, I think people have a really strong radar for the kind of phoniness of that kind of thing, and people have a especially on Twitter, and also to some extent on Tumblr, which is actually where the Binders Full of Women thing lives. They have a really strong sense of really where that's coming from, and you can almost sort of smell if it's coming from the community or if it's coming from an organization. So I think the idea of organizations pouncing on something like this is sort of the wrong one, really, for the organizations. But I think the opportunity is there for somebody to do it. And I think it's happening to some extent, but it's happening at a slower pace than the kind of things that we're talking about. And there's been a couple of recent examples of this. One I think was Old Spice, when they started to do the I'm on a horse type stuff, and they actually started to do more real-time interaction with people that actually started to capitalize on things that were actually in the news, where they would have, I don't know what he's called, the man who smells like the man you want to smell like, whatever his name is, right? They would actually have him interacting with people through sort of very quickly put to market videos where he was actually answering questions or responding to things that were in the news. So that's like one example of it. And the other example that actually has been coming up this week was how an organization responds to that kind of climate in a way that is going to be it's in a way that's going to contribute to the conversation rather than be a corporate response. And the great example of this is actually something that's come up this week with Bodyform. Bodyform have a Facebook page, and somebody left a comment that was a fairly lengthy comment about Bodyform, you've lied to us for years. This is false advertising. Nobody skydives or rides horses or rollerblades, during that period of the month. And it was a very satirical kind of lengthy comment. And what they actually did was they created a video of a fictional CEO of theirs responding to that particular comment. And it's done in such a great way, in such a humorous way, and in many ways a very, very unexpected way, where this female CEO is actually, she shows footage from a focus group, and you just see the faces, you just see reactions, where she'd filmed a focus group of fictional advertising shown to men about the reality of what actually happens, and why they had used metaphors to communicate this for so long in their advertising. And at the end, she passes gas at the end, and she says, I'm sorry to break it to you, but we also do that too. And it's done in such a great way, and it's such a perfect retort to sort of the low-level trolling that was going on the Facebook page anyway. But it was done in a really sort of the spirit of it was really, really great, I think. Gaylord, I know you saw it as well, right?
Yeah, and it really nailed it on a couple of levels. One is that the original commenter, I think, was kind of being funny too. So it wasn't like they were blatantly being angry or whatever, but they were just kind of they were making fun in a kind of an obvious way at advertising for menstruation-related products, right? Like, so they were just making fun about it. And the response then, I guess what's important to think about in that case, one is that, you should watch the video because it's really funny. But the things that are required to take advantage of that opportunity are, one, your organization has to be able to be paying attention to that this is going on, right, and correctly interpret that this guy's comment was serious but also funny. Like, he had a sense of humor about it because he's a human being. Right. And some people can miss it. If you got it wrong, if you either weren't paying attention or you didn't analyze or interpret the situation right, you could have gone off in the wrong direction before you even did anything. And then the next thing they had to have in place was the capability to quickly assemble that video. Like, it's a professional looking video. It's not like they made this with their iPhone or whatever. They had a script. They had multiple cast members. They had location. They had good lighting. I mean, it was a well-produced video. And they had to do all that and deploy it fast enough. Like, if it would have taken 6 weeks to do this, it wouldn't have been funny. Right? If the steam would have been let out of it, air would have been let out of the tires on this particular topic.
Responsiveness is important.
Yeah, and it's a responsiveness not just in terms of like getting it turned around, but like they were doing a response that made fun of themselves. In particular, made fun of their CEO, who wasn't, they used an actress instead of the actual CEO, but like somebody somewhere had to sign off on that pretty quickly for them to be able to build that and deploy it. So it requires that requirement. Like when I think about well, how would my organization, deal with something like that? Because everyone does. Like when we talk about social media, the first thing that comes up with anyone that's kind of tentative is always like, what do I do if someone says something nasty about me on my Facebook page? And these people turned it in, something kind of like that into a win. But it's not like the responsiveness of that entire chain of logistics or whatever was critical. Like just to be able to recognize that there was an opportunity there, I think is hard enough. But then to be able to execute on it in the rapid time scale that's kind of required, I guess, for something to remain connected and humorous.
Yeah, I think a lot of brands are actually starting to realize that capitalizing on the speed of those particular social opportunities is actually sort of increasingly how this stuff works, especially if they want to get their messages out in front of people. And Bodyform's one example, but I know that like Coca-Cola are working with this idea, Campbell's Soup are working with this idea, and the kind of opportunities that are presented with that, the notion of being nimble enough and having, like you said, Gaylord, having almost the empowerment internally,
yes,
to be able to just go do that. The levels of approval have to sort of dissipate at that particular with that particular kind of idea is increasingly a space of opportunity. And I think when I think about like real estate marketing, it's very, very slow in comparison to the kind of things that we're talking about. And people talk about having like an editorial calendar and some kind of structured plan, but that all really kind of goes out of the window in the light of capitalizing on these more timely opportunities, which are a lot more powerful, I think.
Well, yeah, it's about culture.
Well, culture is part of it. The other, of course, I agree with everything you guys are talking about. And it's, I guess, as marketers, there's nothing short of just professional admiration, right? When any company, any brand is able to pull off something like that, a turnaround, or anything. I feel like there's no shortage if we were to look across the entire range of industries that's out there with really smart marketing people of things that we can marvel at, right? There's no shortage of it. We can look at Bodyform video. We can look at some of the, I think a couple of weeks ago, Matt, you were mentioning the Coca-Cola and how they were doing some of their really smart advertising, really smart branding.
With the vending
I think we can really marvel at it. As it pertains to real estate, I guess there's two questions about real estate. And then I actually, wanted to bring this other issue up, which I guess it's all kind of connected. If the proposition is that real estate companies and real estate brands, for whatever reason, right, are not that nimble, right, are not configured in that way, is the issue, is what we're saying then that the culture of your typical real estate brand is in some way inherently unable to be nimble? I guess that's the first question, right? So if we were consulting with real estate brokerages or real estate brands, a Century 21 or a Coldwell Banker, is our recommendation to them something along the lines of, you guys need to change sort of the way you go about making decisions, right? And I don't know that, I guess the first question I have with that is I don't know that that's necessarily the issue, because the second part of this that I have to wonder about, guys, and that you probably know, you could probably speak to this a little bit better. Look across the industry at your peers, right? Gaylor and I do not have the job that you've got. Look across the industry at your peers, at major brokerages, major brands, who have the job of marketing, right? And, without naming names, without, do you really think that the quality of talent in real estate is as high as the quality of talent that's in, let's say, Bodyform or Coca-Cola or, some of these Fortune 500 brands, right? My sense is that it's not, simply because you're not a Fortune 500 company. You don't, the incentive structures are set up the wrong way. So if real estate companies were going to transition in this way, I think the first challenge I would have if I were, a board member of a real estate company or a CEO of a real estate company is, by investing this kind of money and this kind of resource into marketing talent, am I going to see a return on this, right? Closely related to that, though, is the second part, which is I'm not convinced that real estate companies as they exist today, real estate brands as they are today, even if they had the best talent, even if they had the right type of nimble structure, could take advantage of some of these back channel, meme-driven type of stuff. And here's why. We touched on this earlier in this conversation about people can sniff out manufactured conversation, right? And I think you're exactly right. So taking the presidential debate as an example, if somebody mentions mortgage introduction and then NAR went out there and started tweeting about stuff, people just completely ignore it because they would be like, well, you're freaking NAR. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, I have to tell you, like, something that's fascinating and amazing to me is, and you guys probably aren't as aware because I think we've established you're not football fans, the NFL right now has something called franchise that they've been doing. And they are essentially manufacturing this whole conversation from their fans to get them to do stuff like sing their team's fight song on video, and then they would upload it to NFL.com. They're doing stuff like this. And it's obvious. It is absolutely obvious this is manufactured. It's absolutely obvious that this is some idea that came out of NFL corporate marketing, and yet the people are responding, right? And yet the consumers, knowing fully well this is manufactured, user-generated content, community creation, they're still responding. And the only answer that I have to that is the NFL is a brand, and the various teams as a brand stand in a very different place in the consumer's mind than does, say, NAR or real estate brand, right? Because I couldn't imagine a real estate brand being able to pull that off. I couldn't imagine, for example, Coldwell Banker or Century 21 being able to go out and do what, the NFL has done.
Well, Rob, I think what's unfair about I agree with you, but what's unfair about that comparison is that you care about the NFL every Monday night for a season, of the year, every single year. And from what I understand, people care about interacting with a real estate agent, once every few years. So I wonder if it comes back a little bit to that event-drivenness. Like, you have a reason to gather amongst like-minded people who love the NFL every week, and you make an emotional commitment to that. And even though everyone in the real estate industry likes to talk about how it's the most, emotional and biggest, scariest financial decision of your existence, it just happens once every few years in terms of like buying a house or interacting with a realtor. So I wonder whether that plays into that kind of that difference.
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, the way that I think about it is very often when I hear brand marketers speak, they talk about the work that they do with agencies, and they talk about the way that they develop brand positioning, and the process is very, very different from how it currently how it currently exists online for a lot of real estate brands. And I think that the current brand conversation within real estate is a very, very poor one. It's usually focused around a couple of things. Who's the customer? Is it agent brand? Is it brokerage brand? That kind of really quite redundant conversation. In a way that doesn't really capitalize on opportunities that the users are actually presenting to us, like the kind of things that we're talking about today. So, when we talk about why somebody may or may not be able to, capitalize on this in a way that Coca-Cola or the NFL are, however manufactured it may seem, and I'm aware of those NFL things that you're talking about, Rob, and they do have that level of interaction associated with them, even though they are sort of really quite highly fabricated. Nonetheless, they do have that kind of user growth associated with them. I think it's a question of to return to our friend Jeff Turner's point, it's a question of culture and values, and are you associated with a culture of innovation and nimbleness and capitalizing on these particular types of things. And I think if you just look at the data of what's going on versus Jeff's Jeff's point, the answer is absolutely not. The kind of creative that's coming out is very broadcast driven, as we saw in particular during the Super Bowl. And it's very one way. However socially engaged these brands may seem to be, they're nowhere near what we're talking about in terms of body form or Old Spice or what's going on during the debates and being able to capitalize on things. I think there's a huge gulf, really, of opportunity between those two things, and I think it's a cultural thing within the industry as opposed to an ability thing. I think the types of people associated with those departments and the people that you alluded to as being my peers are certainly more than capable of doing this stuff. Whether they're empowered to or not, I can't really speak to that. But it's a question of values and culture and sort of leadership associated with those things as opposed to ability, right?
So how do we turn this around? Right. I guess that's ultimately when we get down to it. It's how do we turn this around? How do we recommend, I guess, to anybody that the three of us might have influence over, what is the way to think about this, right? What does a liberated marketing department look like to you, Matthew?
In many ways, I think about this kind of stuff a lot. A liberated marketing department is empowered to make those kind of decisions to be as entrepreneurial as possible. But ultimately, they're held accountable for the results of what they do. So there's a leash on what they do, but it's quite a long leash, if you like. But and having that particular accountability and setting things like goals and metrics and having data to support the activities of that department is important. But having them empowered to be as entrepreneurial as possible in a way, to Gaylord's earlier point, that erodes those levels of let's call it approval that are traditionally required. I think that's how you get closer to being more responsive and creating the kinds of things that Bodyform just did. And I saw a behind the scenes of how that Old Spice thing worked, and the client had to somewhat sign off on these things to empower the creative agency to be able to film and upload these things in pretty much real time. So it takes quite a leap of faith on the part of the client, and let's characterize that as the brokerage here. It takes a leap of faith to be able to empower somebody to be able to do that, either internally or externally if you're working with an agency. And I think that presents it's already happening, and whether the real estate industry chooses to play in that space or not, I think is going to be very, very interesting.
I think that's clearly going to be the question we tackle. I mean, I think, from my standpoint, guys, I have a very specific recommendation for the associations, I guess, because I think that's the only way they can go forward. But I think with brokerages, it's going to be a little bit of a different deal because they have different purposes. For the associations, I think, based on this conversation, what I would recommend, and anybody listening, hey, if you're in the association, think about this, right? You can't do the speaking yourself. And what occurs to me is that the only companies, the only organizations out there that I'm aware of who have a worse brand than, real estate brands, we like to trash our own, right? We like to talk about our own industry. The brands don't mean anything. Well, it turns out real estate brands are actually really strong and healthy and fine compared to, let's say, the political brands that are out there. DNC, the RNC, the NRA, the, AARP, whatever. I think those brands are really problematic in lots of ways. And yet these memes come out. So I think what I'm suggesting is the only way it happens is you can't manufacture that. I think you have to go create true believers out of private individuals who then will be willing to take action, that advances kind of your cause. And that work, I don't believe that the realtor associates have traditionally done in the same way that some of the other political organizations out there have. So to the extent that, NAR has a social media strategy, that it has a social networking element to it, I feel like they're spending too much time speaking on their own voice instead of trying to create true believers who go out and start pushing memes in real speed as it happens. So I think that's, but that's one recommendation I guess I would make. But it doesn't help the brokers because the broker's not interested in political activism. They're not interested in creating ideology. They're interested in creating customers. They're interested in creating brand impressions, right? For those guys, I think what you're recommending, Matthew, is probably have a huge way towards success. But the only thing I would add on to that, I guess, is everything you said, yes, plus I would add on control over product. Because I don't know, if I were in charge of brand marketing for a brokerage, I don't know how I can do that without having control over, or at least having some say in the actual product that we are selling to the marketplace, which in this case is namely, brokerage services, which means agents and, the agents that we recruit, the agents we train, the service that they offer and how they go about offering it. I don't know if a brokerage is brave enough to take that stance without the owner or the CEO or the broker really doing the same thing. So it leads back to leadership and culture. And gee, I know you have thoughts on leadership and culture. What do you think? Is that the way forward?
So yes, I'm going to distill down some of what you guys have both said so that I make sure I understand it appropriately and so that I can agree with the mutual backslapping society. One is, Rob, you're just describing brand ambassadorship, which is a concept, of course, amongst brand marketers where you activate your customers. So that makes all kinds of sense. Somebody should be thinking about that. How can that be pursued in the real estate industry? And if we were to describe the two-screen or second screen phenomenon as a situation where people are online improving their emotional connection to one another, then that may be a great way to both identify and activate brand ambassadors. So that's kind of one sort of practical thought there. And Matthew, you were bringing up issues of how do you deal with oversight, and I think that's tied directly as well to what Rob is talking about in terms of an HR, I guess, issue of making sure you have the right people on your team, because obviously if you don't, if everybody in your organization isn't, aligned in their thinking at least enough to the, on the core basics of what the brand means, then you can't trust them to go out and do the right thing. You'll be anxious about it, and that is a leap of faith, and it is a scary thing. And I think to some degree, it also, in terms of brand ambassadorship, that could be that's at the agent level as well. It's not just the customers out there, but how many people who are agents for a broker really aren't a brand ambassador of that broker either. There's something in there, and I don't know what it is, but there's something in there that I think that's worth mining. In terms of the two-screen phenomenon, so I've already talked about the event of the television object, the television show, or the news object gathering up like-minded individuals or around a topic as being a potential place to identify and interact with potential ambassadors. There's also the idea of whether it's possible, we've talked about it from the perspective of, we're going to, assuming we're going to be on Twitter engaging on that side of this event. I wonder, and I'm going to throw that out there, if it's possible to be on the other side of the event. Is there any opportunity to be the social object? And hopefully it's not like a negative news item or whatever, but you think about Red Bull's Stratus, thing where they send a guy up in a balloon into space and jumps out, and that becomes the social object that is unifying people at a specific time. Now, I don't know if there's a good, I'm not saying that there's you can do this real estate thing or not, but there's two sides of that equation is the main thing I want to say there, and gathering up some kind of experience with how do you play on the big screen side of this, I think might be useful. And I think, and it would be focused on some kind of time-driven event. And I know Realtor, the Move.com guys are doing some stuff with television now, and I don't see that as playing in this kind of event-driven moment, but they're gathering some experience and some data on how to play on that screen as well. And I think that there may be big opportunities on that side if they're put together and assembled in a creative way. So
yeah, I totally agree, Gaylord, and you're dead right when you're talking about this idea of empowering people to execute on these things in a nimble way. And it is a risky thing. You got to have the right team assembled to be able to do that. But I want to add just one last thing before we wrap up here, in that having a deeper understanding of how information spreads online, particularly across devices, either from the TV to the web, for example, or to the tablet. Having an understanding of these things is really what we're talking about here. There's a fantastic book that I would recommend on exactly this kind of topic from a very, very appropriate source. There's a guy called Paul Adams, who is the head of brand design and brand experience at Facebook. He's an ex-Googler, and he wrote a book called Grouped. And what it does is he uses the data from Facebook to explain how information spreads across the web, not only just within Facebook, but how it spreads between people. And I think that's really the key to all this stuff, is understanding how those opportunities are capitalized on, regardless of who does it, right? Whether it's a community or a brand or something like that. Understanding how that content gets generated, how it spreads, and ultimately how it gets shared and grows. And if you can have, and that's really quite an easy thing to find. Certainly, there's a book that I just referred to, but there's lots of resources online to help with that type of conversation too. And having a real good, deep understanding of that kind of stuff really heads off this idea of just throwing things into the news feed. And it makes those experiences more timely and more appropriate, and ultimately, much, much stronger for, whoever's trying to capitalize on this particular kind of event marketing. And I think it's a really interesting thing that we're going to see a lot more of over the next couple of years. I mean, Rob, do you want to add a final thought to something like that?
Yeah, I love this conversation, personally, because it's exactly a kind of, really high-level theoretical analysis of trends and things that's going on. But I love also the fact that I think, we actually have a couple of really concrete suggestions, right, for folks to try. I guess if I had a conclusion or, sort of thought, sort of as we're closing off, there are two. One is, I'm more or less convinced that the strategies for convincing folks that the National Association and all of these state and local associations are currently using and currently trying to do via social media and social network is wrong, and it's not going to work. And we've explained, I think, through this whole conversation why that is. I think, as Gaylor recommended, if I were them, I would seriously start looking at how do we go about doing activation? How do we go about creating these individuals at all levels that could be your brand ambassadors? That's number one. The second thing on the brokerage side, I think I'm basically in agreement with you that when it comes down to, we're not going to sit here and prescribe specific solutions for specific companies. But as a general matter, I think the issue is the marketing departments, the marketing messages that the brokers have been trying are not going to, it's not going to work really, I guess is the way to look at it, because these spaces of innovation, user behavior changes, all these things that, are evidenced by issues like second screen, are evidenced by issues like, the community responding in certain ways. From that standpoint, fine. If nimbleness is going to be the absolute key, then yeah, there has to be a cultural change. It has to be driven by the CEO. It has to come from the top. Like I said, the only thing I would add on to that is, if a broker is going to really think about doing it in that fashion, you got to create the culture. You got to do the purposeful culture. You have to look at all of your infrastructure and how it's set up. But I think you really also have to think about handing off to the marketing department, some responsibility over product. I don't know how else you do this. That you can't have marketing out there sending out messages and talk about brand promises and doing all these things, and then not having some sort of say in the actual on the foot, on the ground, boots in the trenches agents who then deliver that message. They have to be able to have some control over it. So I think that's, my sort of concluding. That's where I'm at, at the end of this conversation.
Well, gentlemen, I just want to end up with. I just looked up the data for last night's second presidential debate, and during the course of the 90-minute discussion, there were, I'm looking at here on one of the analytics sites, there were 12 million tweets and over 500,000 public Facebook posts about that particular debate going through those two platforms, making it the number 3 most social TV event of all time. So this is no small stuff, that's for sure. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out. So as always, we haven't done this for a couple of weeks, but let's finish off with Rob's timeless suggestions of what we're going to be talking about next week. So, Gaylord, I'm going to put you on the spot first. What are we going to be talking about next week?
Next week, I'm going to be talking about looking forward to a cross-country ski season. We've reached the time of year where all I can think about is when is the snow going to fall so I can put skis on. So that's what I'm going to be talking about next week.
Rob?
I think as a country, as a nation, next week we are going to be talking about Libya. We're going to talk about Libya until we're sick and tired of hearing about Libya. As an industry, I think we're actually going to talk about NARAM. I think we're going to end up talking, as unfortunate as it is to me, about syndication and this new National Association of Real Estate Professionals. That's what I think we're going to be talking about next week.
Yeah, I was reading about that this morning too. I think one of the things that I have my eye on, and I really hope that we're not talking about binders full of women next week. But one of the things I have my eye on is something that I've been reading about the environmental effects of data centers, the actual cost of keeping the web running in terms of environmental concerns. It was starting to be alluded to. Obviously, it's been a large part of the presidential debate discussions about the increasing costs of energy, and that's been very centered on things like the auto industry and car manufacturing and things like that. But I think the actual sort of cost of keeping the web running is a really, really interesting topic. And there was an amazing editorial in the New York Times about the energy concerns over data centers. So that's a particular interest to me. So. Well, as always, thank you, gentlemen, for a great discussion. It's a really, really interesting topic, I think. And I will speak to you all next week. Bye.
All right. Take it easy, everybody. Good time.
Bye.
It's the magic number.